You have questions? We have answers. Welcome to the Therapist Question Box with your host, Miss Lindsay Schiss.
Welcome back to another episode of the Therapist Question Box. I'm your host, Lindsay Schiss. And as always, we're not afraid of your toughest mental health questions, so ask away. Today we have an incredible guest with us, Vince Rocco Vargas. He is a therapist at Therapy Utah, but you may also know him as a veteran entrepreneur, actor, writer, and former Border Patrol agent. Those are all real, right, Vince?
All real, yeah.
All real, it's impressive. He served in the 75th Ranger Regiment and also starred as an actor in Mayans MC. Vince has dedicated his life to leadership, resilience, and personal growth. So he is the person for this episode. I'm excited for this conversation. I'm sure it will be filled with wisdom and honest talk. So Vince, thanks so much for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm always embarrassed to hear my own bio.
Hey, it's impressive. You got a lot of interest and they're varied. So I'm here for it. It's great.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, we're going to be talking about resilience today, and we'll just jump right into the question and then get started. So here is our listener question. I keep hearing about the importance of resilience, but sometimes I feel like I'm just barely holding it together. What does resilience actually look like in real life, and how can I build it without feeling like I'm just forcing myself to be strong all the time? All right. Love that huge question, right?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts when you first heard that?
It's incredible to hear, I guess, someone put it in that way of just like, what does it look like? And I think that's an awesome way to see it. And in the end, what is resilience? Resilience is having the ability to bounce back from hardship, right? Resilience is to be able to get back into kind of a rhythm after things get knocked off the tracks. And so what does that look like? So for instance, in my life, I've been divorced, right? And so what did that look like? For me, it was getting my finances in order, getting my routine back in order, getting my life back into a kind of a moving forward moment. And I think for people to understand, like, what does resiliency look like, I think it looks different in everyone's life, but it has to come from a place of like, am I advancing in a progressive way? Am I getting better? Am I healing? Have I taken the steps to implement things in my life that have made it easier to cope? So that would be where I would say that's what resiliency looks like, is that you've made actions towards healing and improving and fixing. And as long as you've implemented something, well, then that's a form of resilience, as in you're building yourself back up. And I don't think anyone can really identify what resiliency looks like other than if you are in a better place now from when the incident or the situation happened, and you're kind of having a more positive outlook on, okay, things in life can get better or look better. And so I'd say kind of in that space is what for me is what I would say.
Good. That's so helpful to say, are we in a better place? That's a really good barometer, right? Where were we then, and where are we now? And if we're resilient, then we can say we're in a different place, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting, as you said, you went through a divorce. I would imagine that you didn't build resilience during that divorce. I would imagine resilience and working to become resilient probably didn't happen in the midst of the chaos that was happening in your life. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, exactly. I think it happened after I said, okay, this is happening and there's no going back, and we're looking forward. And so what are the steps forward? And essentially I built resilience in multiple areas in this one divorce. I built resiliency in my finances. I built resiliency in my future relationships, knowing, okay, how did this relationship go wrong? What did I do wrong? And it might not have been my fault, or maybe it was, it doesn't matter. It comes, how can I improve in the next relationship so that I can mitigate any potential for this happening again? And so I also became a better father, right? Because now I wasn't counting on the co-parenting lifestyle of like, if I worked and who's home and the kids. No, now I had to kind of take on those relationships individually now. And so I built a resiliency based on the fact that I had to now reshape my life with it just being me and the kids. And so I built resiliency in a lot of ways, and I think it helped for my future relationship. My current spouse now, we've been married almost 9 years, and it's been very healthy, and it's because I've implemented a lot of things from what I learned from my first divorce.
Nice. Isn't that interesting that you've implemented things from your first divorce that probably you may not have done had you not gone through that, right? Like,
correct.
I would imagine, right? So sometimes we look at it and just think like, oh, worst thing ever. And yet it actually has probably changed the way you show up in your marriage, in your finances, and probably in a really good way.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like, I realize now I have built really good resiliency techniques throughout my life because I've been through a lot of hardships from military deployments, but also, unhealthy relationships when I was younger and other childhood traumas. But I think playing sports kind of built resiliency slowly, and it's why I really believe in my kids playing sports. It's kind of this, it's man-made. It's man-made a hardship, right? You're making your kids go through adversity, through their losses. And so it's a really healthy way of them trying to learn how to build from those losses, build from how do I get better, or a loss is a loss. How do I manage it? Do I handle it with grace or do I not, right? And me playing baseball as a kid, I really believe built me to have resiliency because, when you play the sport of baseball, in any sport, there's a lot of loss. And then that catapulted me into the military. And in the military, there was a different level of loss, right? And that was a different level of resiliency I had to build. And so kind of continuing to do that, I felt I've always been very fortunate to be good at that. And not everyone has that same upbringing. Not everyone has that same opportunity of building resiliency throughout their life. And sometimes that's why, with the question we had, what does it look like? They probably haven't had a lot of hardship. And so one little hardship could be massive to them, right? And so it's very different in everyone and how they kind of frame it.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that you said, you learned it from a young age. You learned it in sports. You learned how to get back up and try again and really try to stay focused even with a loss, or, you struck out or whatever it might be. But that, everyone has a different upbringing and perspective when it comes to loss and difficulty in their life. And what might be super detrimental and painful for one person and maybe feel like the world's coming to an end may be a blip in somebody else's story, right?
Yeah.
And so, I wonder about that. How do we look at, understanding the loss to resiliency, but also one thing that feels so important is not just going from, oh, this happened, okay, buck up, here we go, but actually as a therapist, how do we feel the pain and know when it's time to go, okay, it's time to move through this, but not try to skip over that part?
Yeah, it's so interesting because this is me and my wife. I've lost all my grandparents. My wife still has all four. And I'm sitting here sometimes thinking like, ooh, this one's going to sting for her. And can you hear me?
Okay, yes. Can you start again? Because I could not hear you.
Yeah, no problem. So this is an interesting one because this reminds me of me and my wife. We have very different lives, and my wife still has all four grandparents, which is like fascinating to me because I've lost all my grandparents at a young age. And I keep thinking how this is going to sting really hard for her because she's never really lost a loved one in her life. She doesn't even know what that looks like. And so when she does, I know I can't handle it like I would myself. Is like, I've been through this before. I've experienced loss of a grandparent, and okay, it's going to hurt a little less because I know what this feels like. But for my wife, she doesn't even know how to comprehend what that even looks like. And so for me, is what I would even tell my kids. My son, he lost his grandfather recently. It was just like, soak in it, live in it. It's okay to feel what it feels like to lose someone. Remember the good times. Let's laugh about some of the stories. That's all natural, and the grieving process for everyone is different. Everyone will go through that process on their own, and some will take days, weeks, months. It's different for everyone. But at some point, when that grieving process starts to hinder daily life, we have to start taking some actions towards, okay, there's got to be an acceptance phase here that we move forward and continue to thrive.
Okay, so that is a really good marker, is to say, okay, when it's hindering daily life, maybe that's when we know it's time to start moving to that next step of, okay, what can I do that will start helping me to move through this? Like this grieving part is so important, and I feel so strongly about that we allow ourselves to feel the pain, to sit in it, to process it, right? But that when it starts to hinder daily life, well, then we need to maybe look at, okay, what are the strategies that we have in our tool belt that we can utilize to move through this pain? And it's interesting. I often wonder that, sometimes we don't even know the capacity of our own resilience, of our own inner strength, until we've been through something like that. And then we can draw on things that we don't even know are there. Do you feel like that has been the case for you, that you've drawn on things that maybe you didn't even know you had the capacity to go through? I would imagine in the military, there were things that you never anticipated, maybe seeing or feeling the way that you felt in those circumstances. So curious about that maybe we underestimate our well of resilience and the depth of which our capacity for healing.
Yeah, that's, I was so young in the military, 22 years old, 23 years old, didn't have a life of a lot of experience, but I did grow up in Los Angeles, California, during a heavy gang era, which means it wasn't unfamiliar territory to hear a drive-by shooting, right? So the first shooting in Afghanistan wasn't a surprise to me. So that was built resiliency. That's me, because of how I was raised, I was familiar with what that sounded like. And those who were raised in other cities or states that wasn't prevalent to gangs didn't have that same correlation. So they didn't build the resiliency of understanding, having a kind of the preparedness of what that felt like, what it did to their body physiologically, like the emotions you have. And that was mine. So I was fortunate and unfortunate to be raised in that kind of environment. Going into Iraq, it was a beneficial tool. It was something that was very successful for me to be able to be comfortable in a very chaotic moment. But there's other things like loss or in combat we call it collateral damage. Some of the things you didn't expect to see in combat happen. And how did I manage those? Well, that was a challenge for me, because it made me question whether my faith would come into question in the future, right? Would God judge me for these choices? And so that became something that I had to manage myself that I never expected in my life. And so, I had to kind of learn multiple different layers of how I can heal myself when it comes to moral injury, right? As well as then you had post-traumatic stress, and then you just had plain right, just like experiences that were like, man, that was a heavy experience. How do I manage that into their life? And so I think everyone's upbringing really kind of prepares them for, or doesn't prepare them for, just the existence of what we see daily. And during the military, I don't think anyone's really prepared fully for what happens in combat. And we all kind of walk away from that a little bit different. And I'm very fortunate enough to kind of identify these markers and areas that I needed to address early on with counseling and with other different tools. And so honestly, everyone is, I would say, if I hope I answered it well, is that, I was raised with a certain set of skills because of my environment, and it did help me in sometimes in other areas I wasn't prepared for.
Yeah. And it sounds like it was an environment that was rough sometimes. I mean, if you were used to hearing gunshots, that there was some difficulty in that environment, but then also it wasn't the first time you had heard it when you went to war. Like that was something that was a little more familiar. So it's interesting. You could look at that and say, boy, it was unfortunate that I had that kind of upbringing. But you could also turn the script and say, but look at it. It actually allowed me to not quite be so impacted by this, because I was used to it, right? So, you said something. You said you were healed from moral injury. I'm curious your thoughts and what you feel like you were able to do specifically to heal yourself from moral injury. Because I think that's often what we face in our day-to-day, right? We're not going to combat. We're not doing some of these things. I mean, some of us are, but generally we're not often doing that. What does it take to actually heal ourselves from moral injury? I love that you said that, because sometimes, those wounds are in our hearts. They're not, nobody else sees them. They're pains that nobody else sees. What does that look like?
I think it came down to learning how to reframe those experiences, right? Really define, my intentions in combat were pure. My intentions in combat were to word it gently, was to fulfill the mission, and sometimes in that mission, there were some unfortunate circumstances where people got hurt and not intentionally. And so you don't see that at the time. And you also, if you're someone who's raised with faith, everything you do in combat is questioned. And so I was battling this idea that I would be judged for choices because I was in a platoon that did these actions, and in all honesty, everything was justified in what we did in combat. It really was. I was in a special operations unit, right? And so everything is justified in the event that we were trying to capture these high value targets. And in the event of that, if there was gunshots, then we'd engage. And so it left you questioning sometimes whether your God would question you, whether your God would see it the way you did. And that moral injury became a challenge because then you started to have a lot of guilt. And that guilt just manifested into other things. What it turned in for me was drinking. I started turning to drinking so I could cope with the guilt that I had deep inside of this moral injury. And so I started to learn these things like, why am I having this self-destructive personality? Why am I doing all these things to try and destroy my life? And I'm trying, like, deep inside, I want to have a good life. But every decision I make is just crumbling my life around me. And that's when I started to learn things like, the self-destructive mechanism that I have in me really is rooted towards this moral injury and this deep guilt. And I had to start unpacking that, and I had to start healing that guilt and understanding. And so I started to reframe the idea of why the decisions were made in combat were the decisions of a 23, 24-year-old man who felt it was life and death situation and took actions. And that's okay. And my goal was to stay alive. My goal was to come home to my wife and kids. And I had good intentions. And so being able to reframe that would put it to me was, okay, I feel okay with that decision. Now, how does my God feel? Well, as I matured in my connection with God and faith, I stopped thinking I had to earn points with God. And when I stopped believing this earning points and this like, if I do one thing bad, I have to do 10 things good. When I stopped believing in that nature of it and just started, I came to terms with God loved me for who I am. My intentions were pure, and I'm forgiven in those choices I made. And that really was starting to heal this deep-rooted guilt that I had inside of me. And I really believe we have to reframe some of those ideas because we are our own worst enemies in those thoughts. And as well as if it becomes one with faith, well, I think we have to better understand our God, that he's not looking for you to stack up the good points to counter the bad. And so when I stopped thinking that way, well, then it wasn't a challenge of like, if I can keep doing good, I'm going to outweigh the bad. That helped me a lot because I think as a young, immature man of God, that's how I saw the world.
And that paradigm shift of that he wasn't keeping score about like, check, nope, he keeps doing bad things and, acting in these ways. But it sounds like you really changed the way that you saw God in your life.
Absolutely.
That he wasn't keeping score and marking you off for all the things that you had done. And I'm curious if your forgiveness of self came after that feeling of maybe seeing God in a different light.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I believe that's exactly what it is. The guilt I held was more of like, man, did I hurt my chances of going to heaven? And once I was able to reframe the view of God, I think I was able to be a lot less pressure on myself. I went from being an infantry soldier, which is someone who is trained to engage the threat, to a medic, someone who is trained to save lives, because I had so much guilt in me. I just wanted to like, how many lives can I save? How many lives can I save? And I'm keeping a tally of how good I'm doing. And that was such a heavy burden to carry for so long that when I stopped thinking that God was keeping score, it really kind of relieved me of a lot of my stress.
Wow. And I would imagine that you're wanting to do good your motive changed. It was probably because that's who you wanted to be versus I've done all these bad things and the score is racked up, so I got to equalize the score on the good things, right? But instead saying, no, actually, this is who I want to be as a person. This is who Vince is a person that does good things and that helps people and being a medic aligned with those values, right? So
exactly.
I'm really curious when, to me, it goes back to living in our values. Bad things happen to good people. We have things in our lives that upset our path, who we are, what our plan is. How do we live in our values when we are knocked off our equilibrium, when our path that we had planned doesn't go? Like, how do we stay in our values even when we are so, discouraged or distraught? Like, what does that look like to you from a practical perspective?
I think we all fall short at times, right? We all make mistakes. We are human. And it's just like in the addiction space. Some people just, they fall off the wagon, and it happens. And I think it's nothing more than just, if we use a baseball term, it's dusting yourself off, getting back in that box and getting right back to it, And I think that's completely what it is. We have to, I would say, give ourselves grace in the fact that we do stray from the path at times. But I just continue to try and keep my mind on the prize in the sense of, like, just keep doing good, keep improving life, keep moving forward. And, I might fall off the tracks a little bit, but let's get right back on it and keep moving. That's part of resiliency in itself, is staying the path and getting back to the routine of the good. And that's pretty much all I try and do all the time.
I love that. And that, to me, feels actually pretty simple. Like, hey, you fell off the wagon. What are you going to do? Stay off and go back and go in the dust and roll around in the mud, or are you going to try to get back on, right? And, recognizing that, we all do that. That's part of the human experience. We're all going to fall off the wagon, but it's a matter of what we do when we're off and how long it takes us to get back on, right? And again, when you fall off the wagon, what does it do? It provides compassion. You see the world differently when you've had those experiences. And I think that it's not a bad thing, right? I think if we hold ourselves to the standard that, like, you can never make a mistake, you can't fall off that wagon, boy, we're going to be in a world of hurt. But recognizing falling off the wagon actually is part of our human experience. It's what gives us richness and understanding of other people, and our compassion increases. So instead of looking at that like it's a big, oh my gosh, like I've gone all these steps backwards, but instead, wait a minute, like I can add this to my tool belt. I can become a better person because of this. Like there's a reframe there that I think is so important.
Yeah, I love that. It is human existence, and it is part of life. And like I said, giving yourself a little bit of grace and saying, this is part of the story. This is part of the story. What a hell of a story this is going to be in the future when I tell it that time I fell off and came right back.
Yes, absolutely. And it helps you relate to other people, right? I mean, I think of kids, and you're saying, I was a 22-year-old immature man that believed in God and wanted these things, but kind of had an immature way of managing it, right? Of figuring out that relationship. And gosh, how did it change? It changed because you had some really hard things happen. So congratulations. Like, that added to your story. That's part of the deal, right?
That's it.
It's awesome.
Yeah, I love that.
I love that. So tell me this, is there anything that you feel like again, we don't build resilience when we're in the storm, but we build resilience before the storm, sometimes after. What are some practical tips that you could give our listeners that you would say help you to build resilience, help you to get back on the wagon? Again, not when you've fallen off, but when you're in a good spot.
I like, there's several things that I tell some of the guys I work with is have a routine, right? Have this routine that is a solid, healthy routine, whether it be the gym, whether it be breathing exercises, whether it be prayer, whatever that routine is. Getting back to that routine is the first part of resiliency. Get back into the system, to get back into, right? You said, get back on the tracks, right? It's very important. But in between all those, during the times are good, start building those tools. Really identifying what is your routine. Do I do yoga? Do I do breathing? Do I meditate? Do I work out? Do I journal? Right? These systems that we put into place, as much as they are good for wellness, those are a good kind of indicator whether you're back on the tracks or not. It's like when life gets chaotic, I'm like, oh, I've stopped my workout routine. I'm eating terribly. I haven't done my hikes in a while. All that is like, that's chaos, right? That gets wild, and it's hard to control that. If you get back on a very steady routine with these tools that have been implemented in your lives that are for wellness, man, that's going to get you back on the tracks. That's going to get you back into a system. And then you could really evaluate, like, okay, where am I at right now? Now we're only moving forward. And so incorporate these things into your life now so that in the event that it gets chaotic, you could put it right back onto the tracks faster.
Love that. Incorporate them now so you can get back on the tracks faster. Such a good reminder. And it's interesting because those are the things often that go first, right? Like, oh, I usually work out, but this happened, or I usually journal, but then this. It's like those self-care things that actually help us stay grounded in a place of regulation are sometimes the first thing that goes when we struggle, right? So I love that. Like, let's get right back to those things that actually help you stay on the track. Even though you feel like you're off, like, go back to those. So such a good reminder. Vince, is there anything else that you want to make sure that our listeners hear about resilience that feels important that maybe I didn't ask or we didn't talk about?
No, I think this is a great discussion. I think, there's a lot of layers to this, but as long as, for me, if you're out there and you're trying to figure out your life, I'd say build a routine first. And once you have a solid routine, that's going to help kind of see where things start falling off the track so you can get it right back on.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. And, just to recap a few of the things that you talked about is really giving yourself grace. I think that was such a good reminder that when we fall off the wagon, that we give ourselves grace. We recognize it's part of the journey and hop back on. Instead of, we fell off the wagon and then we're going to go do some more self-destructive behaviors. No, like, you got off, hop back on, no problem, part of the story, right? I love that. I love the perspective that understanding that God was okay with who you are and what you did. And so then you started acting in ways that reflected that. You started living in your values because that's who you are, not because you wanted to even out the score of all the bad you had done, but that's actually who Vince is, and that matters. I love that reminder. Also, the reminder of having a routine, working out, breathing, journaling, understanding that those things that bring you back into a regulated state, you need to continue with those things. So really appreciate those reminders. And Vince, really, I appreciate you joining us today. Your insights and your experience are so valuable. And I think regardless if you were you served in the military or not, the principles resonate across the board. So really appreciate that. If you found today's episode helpful, be sure to subscribe and share with someone who could benefit. And we would love a review as well. As always, we love hearing from you, so feel free to reach out with any thoughts or questions. So take care of yourself until next time.